So welcome to week 4 of the new series. We hope that it's really been a time of renewal for you and that you have learned something new about yourself and about God, and that you really feel like He's doing something new and something different to you. This week is a really exciting topic for me. It's about the new covenant, which is really significant as Jesus started to explain to His disciples a little bit more about this newness that He brought. And this passage that we're reading from tonight comes from Matthew 26, from verse 28. And this is at the Last Supper, where Jesus was sitting with His disciples, and they were having a meal they'd had many times together. And He suddenly did something different. And then He lifted up the wine and He said, "This is the blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sin." And Jesus came to introduce newness to God's people. He came to restore, to redeem, and He came to introduce a new way of doing things, a new hope, and a new covenant. So remember, the first covenant came from when God met the people at Mount Sinai with Moses, way back when they came out of Israel. So they weren't a nation, they were slaves, and then they came out of Egypt. And at Mount Sinai, they really became a nation when God gave them the law, and that was the first covenant. This is the covenant that they were supposed to keep. And in actual fact, you could go back before that, even to Abraham, when God chose Abraham, and remember, He instituted the covenant of circumcision with Abraham to have this identifying factor that this was His people. And so God had made covenants with people throughout history about really how to be in relationship with Him. And it always had to do with both parties doing something. Abraham had to institute the covenant of circumcision. I don't think that was super popular. It's a little bit of a sacrifice, a little bit of a scary thing to do perhaps. And he had to do that in order to be one of God's people. The people in the Old Testament after Moses, they had to obey the law as given by God to be in that covenant relationship with Him. And we know that they didn't really get it right very often.
But a covenant requires sacrifice. It always will. Something has to give from both parties. Somebody has to give up something, and the other person has to reciprocate. Otherwise, there cannot be a covenant. This is what Jesus was explaining at the Last Supper. It was that He was literally going to give up His life to create a new covenant with humanity.
He was going to do all the work. There wasn't anything required on our part except the faith
And obedience, and our stepping into that relationship with Christ. And Jesus does that with covenants even today. He says, "I will give 99%, but I'm requiring 1% from you." And that is obedience and acceptance of this love and this relationship that I extend to you. And throughout the scriptures, you can see how this covenant is portrayed again and again and again and again. Like the ripping of the curtain into two is Jesus saying there is a new covenant, there is a new way of doing faith.
So maybe just to explain that a bit, I think in the Old Testament how covenants were made, and to show the seriousness of a covenant. It's actually the Hebrew word to make a covenant is actually karat berit, which means to cut a covenant. The direct translation is to cut a covenant.
And this is a bit gruesome.
It is a bit gruesome, but stuff was gruesome back then. They were into animal sacrifices and all these things. So in that day, a covenant would become legally binding. So today what we do is we sign.
Yes.
Not in blood or anything, just luckily in ink. But we still talk about cutting a deal, or striking a deal. So there's still this element of violence in the way we speak about it. But so what would happen is that people would decide to make a covenant about something, and then they would literally cut something. So they would cut an animal in half, or cut some kind of sacrifice. So there would be a sacrifice that they would cut in half and split into two pieces and put, separate them. And then the two people making the covenant would have to walk through these two pieces together as a symbol of...
over what was left in the middle, which is a delightful
pretty
thought.
Gross. They had to walk across that as a symbol of basically, this is the seriousness of it.
It's a matter of something offering up its life.
So it's kind of the equivalent of us saying today, I swear on your mother's life or on your mother's grave type of thing. And so it's about the seriousness of the commitments of the covenant, that something had to die. And it's also about those people being bound together. And so there's this imagery of being cut. And so that's that image of the temple curtain ripping in two. It's this cutting of a new covenant, that now there's a separation between those two things, and we can enter through that into a new kind of covenant with God.
Into a space where the high priest was only allowed, and that is the Holy of Holies, into God's presence, into His essence, which created a whole new dynamic for the world. It created a whole new dynamic for humanity, because God was cutting a new covenant with not a select few, not a chosen nation anymore, but with humanity as we know it, and which means you and I get to step into the Holy of Holies every day, and we are entering into that covenant on a daily basis with God, and we get to be in that relationship with Jesus Christ, which sometimes we take for granted, that we get to dwell in His presence every day. But that is the new covenant that He's cut with us, is that nothing can separate us again from the love of Christ. And
it's not about the rule keeping like it was with the Israelites, that they got those commandments from Moses that were 10 and turned into 300 laws that they had to keep. That's not where our salvation comes from. It's a new covenant. It's a new way of engaging with God. I mean, it's so beautiful, that Passover meal that Jesus had with His disciples that night. They had the Passover every year, and as Jews, they would be so familiar with the ritual of how that was done. And then Jesus broke with tradition at one moment in the Passover meal. And, He picked up that bread and He broke it. Again, there's that breaking of the covenant, which just symbolizes that whole thing about His body being broken, and the wine, His blood being poured out, and the newness of the covenant that He was bringing, to say there's a whole new way of relating to God that is coming. It's not about what you do. It's not a work salvation and having to earn my salvation. It's about accepting the gift of my brokenness poured out for you.
Okay. So you've been asking me all the questions. Now I'm going to ask you a question tonight. What does a new covenant look like for us today? What is, how do we translate what Jesus is saying here at the Last Supper to our lives, and how does it apply to us in terms of a covenant, and the new covenant that we hold?
I think that it's about just being reminded that it's never about religion, it's about relationship. It's not about how we relate to God. The only thing that really matters in how we relate to God is our relationship with Him and the quality of that relationship. Jesus died to give us intimacy with God, and are we really living in fullness of that intimacy? Because it's not about anything we can do. It's not about earning brownie points. It's not about checking all the boxes. It's not about doing all the right things. It's about being in a personal, real relationship with God. That is the new covenant. It's the covenant of grace, of intimacy, and really being able to connect with God meaningfully.
Yeah, and I think grace is at the root of life as we know it now as Christians. We don't understand what it means to live in the Old Testament. We live through the eyes of grace now. And I think sometimes we take the covenant that we have received too flippantly. If we had to look at it in the Old Testament, it was literally a matter of life and death. If you broke covenant, you could be put to death.
Well, you had to bring an animal to sacrifice to die in your place.
There's this. It's a matter of life and death, and today we see it. Our covenant with Christ very differently. We see it through the eyes of grace, and we can never take that grace for granted. We need to understand the severity of a covenant and what a covenant actually means in the eyes of Christ, because Christ sees it as it was in the Old Testament, but He extends it beyond just a rule and a regulation, and He says, I will be in relationship with you, and there is grace, but I understand the severity of what a covenant and the weight of what a covenant actually means, and what it should mean to us today.
Yeah, and we're invited into that relationship with God, and then because of that, we're called to live differently. People who are part of this new covenant have to live a new way, and we'll speak a bit more about that next week and the week after that. But there's a different way of living that comes with living in that covenant and living in that intimacy of relationship with God. But ultimately, we're called to connect with Him, to live in His freedom, to know that it's not about keeping the rules and regulations, but it's about living under grace because of His love for us.
And that He has paid the sacrifice so that we can live in this covenant freely and with the grace that is extended to us. So, accept the new covenant. If you've never accepted Christ before, now you understand the meaning of what it means to step into relationship with Christ and the severity of a covenant with the living God. So I urge you to step into a covenantal relationship with Christ and understand what that means.
And don't take your relationship with God for granted, but really treasure that and being able to come boldly before the throne of grace. So may we all just take a moment and remember that this coming week, that we can live in a relationship with the Most High God because of what Jesus did for us.
Covenant.